because first of all, it's unverifiable. The data doesn't exist. And that's not the meaning of the story. The story is not about two historical figures. The story is about an explanation about the human condition. Much different kind of story. So myths then, they're about meaning. So it answers these kind of questions. What is? Now, what is the world like that we're living in? Yeah, what is the world like that we're living in? And secondly, what should the world be like? In other words, how are things at the moment? Do we like it or don't we like it? And then also, how should it be? In other words, to what end should we be moving? And these are not questions that science can answer. They're not scientific questions. And then thirdly, therefore, how should we act in order to transform the present state in which we're living? So you may feel like, okay, my reality is I'm living in hell. Do I like living in hell? Not very much. How do I think life should be like? Oh, something very different. Okay, how do I get from A to B? Yeah. And so that's very different kind of questions and very different kind of answers. And so this is from Jordan Peterson. He has lots of little helpful diagrams like that. The way things are, the unbearable present, what should be the ideal future, and a planned sequence of behavior, how to get from here to here. Yeah. What do we need to do? How do we need to think? How do we need to behave to create a different kind of society? So it's the diagram or a little picture I often use when I'm teaching heart workshops, quite helpful. Science focuses on explaining the physical dimension of reality. How do things work? Religion focuses on explaining the spiritual dimension. Why? So a little story here. There's a little boy comes in, finds the kettle boiling in the kitchen, asks his big brother, who's a science major, why is the kettle boiling? The big brother gives a long explanation about how gas is formed, from rotting organic vegetation under the sea, and it's all been piped, and how lighting the gas, oxygen and carbon and methane to generate heat, etc. Our little boy is totally mystified. Anyway, so mum comes into the kitchen and he says to mum, why is the kettle boiling? And she says, it's tea time. Two answers, both of them are correct, but they're different answers to different kinds of questions. So that's similar, the difference between science and myth. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, even though sometimes people think we can live without myth, a lot of people think, well, this is the age of science, we don't need religion anymore, we don't need to have myths anymore, we need just to have facts and just follow the facts, follow the science. But in reality, as Jordan Peterson says, the individual cannot live without beliefs, without action and valuation. In other words, without deciding to do something. And what do we decide to do? That's based upon the values that we have. We might decide to do this or decide to do that, depending upon our values, which goes back to what our beliefs are. And science cannot provide that belief. Are the myths we've turned to since the rise of science more sophisticated, less dangerous, and more complete than those we rejected? So in the secular world, which you mentioned yesterday, a lot of people rejected the Christian myth and Christianity and religion and just want to have secular knowledge and everything to be secular, not bringing God into things. The ideological structures that dominated social relations in the 20th century appear no less absurd on the face of it than the older belief systems they supplanted. They lacked, in addition, any of the incomprehensible mystery that necessarily remains a part of generally artistic and creative production. So that is a really important aspect, that some things just are incomprehensibly mysterious and unable to be expressed or described using science, and is that which is the origin of a lot of artistic and creative production. The fundamental propositions of fascism and communism were rational, logical, stateable, comprehensible, and terribly wrong. No great ideological struggle presently tears at the soul of the world, but it's difficult to believe we've outgrown our gullibility. So look at the date, 1999. The following year was 9/11, and this huge rise of Islamism and this huge, one of the sort of ideological struggles tearing the world apart, and then also the rise of identity politics and gender politics, again tearing society apart in Europe and Britain, huge ideological struggles about the European Union and Brexit. And I think we're in the middle of a struggle at the moment caused by the coronavirus, how to respond to the coronavirus. Again, that's an ideological thing. People often say we're just following the science, but that's dishonest. Basically, people are making political decisions about what to do. And some of these decisions are good ones and some of them are bad. And it's really important to understand the nature of reality in order to be able to make good decisions and to have a good understanding of how things work. And so Nietzsche, I forgot to put his name down here, he was very perceptive. He was, whatever people think of him, he was one of the most profound and thinkers of the 19th century in his analysis of the way that Christian Europe was decaying. And he says, when you give up Christian belief, one deprives oneself of the right to Christian morality. Christianity is a consistently thought out and complete view of things. If one breaks out of it, a fundamental idea, such as belief in God, one breaks the whole thing to pieces. One has nothing of any consequence in one's hands. Christianity presupposes that man does not know, cannot know what is good for him and what is evil. God alone knows. Christian morality possesses truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with belief in God. If modern people really do believe they know of their own accord, intuitively, what is good and what is evil, if they think they no longer have a need of Christianity as a guarantor of morality, that is merely a consequence of the ascendancy of Christian evaluation. The origin of modern morality has long been forgotten, so highly conditioned nature of its right to exist is no longer felt. So that was the reality I was talking about a little bit yesterday, and people are trying to find an alternative base for ethics and morality without recourse to the Bible. But actually the moral values and ethical judgments of the people who came up with these secular moralities and ethical systems was identical to Christian morality. It's just they're trying to find an alternative basis for Christian morality without God. That's utilitarianism and all these different things. But at the end of the day, when you try and do that, it just falls to pieces because one thing, it lacks a motivation. Why should I be good? And the whole thing basically just falls apart, as we can see happening now, that people don't even accept the basic moral judgments that people always accept in the past. So how do myths work then? It's really important to understand they work. I don't know how many of you have seen this film. For me, it's a recent film, but for some people it's like, oh, well, that was like 10 years ago. It was, but anyway, this is a great film. I recommend you should all watch it if you haven't seen it. Slumdog Millionaire, and it's about life in a part of India, and when you see this film, or even better, if you go to India, you can only be shocked by the way that things are. You can only be shocked by the extreme levels of poverty, the extreme levels where poverty such that people are begging in the streets, where children are sleeping in the streets, etc., etc. And when you go there and you see this, the film, or you actually see it, you wonder, how is it possible for Indians to accept and not question or challenge a society which to us appears to be very unfair and unjust? The kind of things you see in India wouldn't be tolerated anywhere within Europe, because people feel that's not right, that's not fair, that's unjust. We need to do something about it. We need to change this, these extremes of wealth and poverty. So you wonder, why is it like that? Why do people put up with it? Why doesn't anybody challenge it or do something about it? It's because they have something called a caste system. And this means, in England, we used to have what's called a class system, so feudalism. That's what's called a caste system. And there's different levels within this society. At the bottom, there's people called the untouchables. They're people who live on the streets, they sweep the streets. And if you're born an untouchable, you live as an untouchable, you die as an untouchable. That's your life. And then above that, there's people who are peasants. They have their own, they do farming or servants. Then above that, the merchants, businessmen, landowners. Above that, there'd be the warriors and kings in the past, or nowadays there'd be people working in the bureaucracy. And right above that, there'd be the priests and the intellectuals and academics. And if you're born into one of these castes, you'd live your entire life in one of these castes, and you wouldn't expect to go up or down, and you'd die within that caste. And you wonder, well, why is it like that? How is it possible that people down at the bottom here don't think, well, I'm fed up sweeping the streets all day. Actually, I'd like to go into business and have my own shop. Or why is it that people who are peasants think, oh, I don't like being a peasant anymore. I want to go and, become a landowner or a businessman myself. Why is it people just accept the reality of their life and they don't question it and they don't try to change it, generally speaking? It's because of the myth, called the myth of reincarnation. So in the Hindu myth, when someone's born, then they're born into a certain social status and they live their life. And then when they die, then they are reborn. They go into the spirit world and their soul is is born again into another life. Transmigration of the souls, it's called in Greek philosophy. And so you just keep going round and round and round like this. And the idea here is if you live a good life, if you're an untouchable and you don't complain, you accept your position in life, you do all your duties very faithfully, cleaning the toilets and sweeping the streets and not complaining, then when you're born next time round, you get promoted. You come back as a peasant. And if you're a good peasant and you work faithfully in the fields, doing everything you need to do, and then when you die, you'll get promoted. You'll come back as a merchant or a landowner. And if you're a good merchant and you're very honest, you don't deceive anybody, you don't cheat your customers or anything, then you'll come back as a warrior or a king, and eventually you carry on being a good king, and you don't oppress people, you don't do nasty things, you don't attack people, then you'll come back as a priest or an intellectual. If, on the other hand, you are a merchant, but you cheat your customers, then next time round you get demoted and you come back as a peasant. And if you're a lazy peasant, then you get demoted and you come back as a street sweep or a toilet cleaner. And that's the way it works. That's their myth. And so the idea here is that the myth then, if you get to this point here, becoming an intellectual and you get enlightened, then you experience moksha, which means you're liberated from this cycle of birth and rebirth. So this way you can see that this myth, the myth of reincarnation, supports the status quo of the caste system. If there was no myth of reincarnation, people wouldn't put up with the reality which they experience, and they want to change their society, make it much more egalitarian and much more fair and much more just. But because they all buy into this myth and they believe this myth, they believe the way things are is the way things are supposed to be. Therefore, don't criticize or challenge the status quo. So the way things are is the way things are supposed to be. That means a person who's an untouchable feels it's only fair that I should be an untouchable sweeping the streets because maybe in a previous life I wasn't such a good person. On the other hand, a person who's right at the top is very wealthy and very rich. He feels it's only fair that I should be wealthy and rich and have a nice, comfortable lifestyle because in a previous life I was really good. And then a person who's right at the top looks down at the person who's an untouchable and doesn't feel any compunction or any need to go and change things because he feels it's only fair and right that person who's living on the street should be living on the streets. That's justice, that's fairness, that's the way it's supposed to be. And so it's very, very hard then to change anything. So the values of these myths then, they become embedded in cultural assumptions. And so the myths then, they express certain values, and then they become embedded in the cultural assumptions, then they become embedded in the social structures. Yeah, that makes sense? So social structures then within any society are a function of the myth which underlies that society. So how do you change things? How is it possible to change India, for example? It's not that people haven't tried. The Buddha tried, Guru Nanak tried, Christian missionaries went there and they tried. Well, the way to change things is to change, if you want to change the world, you have to change your story. This is Ivan Illich. He was an Austrian Catholic priest and also an anarchist. I don't quite know how they fit together. But anyway, so he said this: neither revolution nor reformation can ultimately change a society. Rather, you must tell a new, powerful tale, one so persuasive that it sweeps away the old myths and becomes a preferred story, one so inclusive that it gathers up all the bits of our past and our present into a coherent whole, so that even shines some light into the future, so we can take the next step. If you want to change a society, you have to tell an alternative story. And I think basically that's what Father was doing. He was telling a new story, a different story. Because if you change the way we are, if we think in a certain way, then we look at the world in a certain way, we treat people in a certain way, and we create a certain kind of culture, And that culture leads to establishing a certain kind of society and certain kinds of structures within that society. So all these things are an expression. And what is it that we think? We're thinking within the realm of a myth, a story going around our heads about ourselves, or we may have the Hindu story running around our heads, or the Muslim story, or the Sikh story, or the Christian story, or the Protestant story, which again is very different to the Catholic story. And each of these stories leads to a different sense of identity, and it creates a different way of looking at the world, that creates a different way of relating to people in the world, creates a different kind of culture, and that creates a different kind of society and a different kind of structures within that society. So if we want to change the world, you don't go on the streets burning things down. You have to change what you think, change what you believe, change the story that people have. And that's what Martin Luther King did as well. It's what Father did. It's all about that, changing the way people think, so they change the way they behave, and they change the way they relate, and the society then will start to change. That's why it's so important then. What kind of stories we have running around in our head, what kind of myth it is that we buy into. And the reality is, whether we like it or not, we're living in one myth or another. And it's good to try and understand what it is that we're doing. So, as I said there, whether we like it or not, we're living in a world of myths. So I said all religions, they have myths of creation, fall, and restoration. All nations, they have origin stories. Like the Koreans have got some story about, I think, a bear and a tiger or something. And every country has its own origin stories, and also how it relates to other nations. The Jewish people, their self-understandings of the chosen nation, chosen to bring knowledge of God and ethics to the world. The Germans in the past had a sense of being the master race, should run the whole of Europe. Chinese call themselves a middle kingdom, a central kingdom. They see themselves also as the center of the world. So every nation then has a myth. Political philosophies as well, as I mentioned yesterday, also have certain kind of myths to legitimize and sustain power. So the Divine Right of Kings, for example, which came up with one particular English king, he claimed that God anointed him, God appointed him, and that he didn't have to obey the laws because he had what was called the Divine Right of Kings. And some people bought into that idea, but most English people didn't, and so there's a civil war and he was overthrown. So basically the way myths function then is to maintain and justify and legitimize power and authority and structures. And there are also racial myths and also family myths. I'm sure you got family stories about your parents and grandparents and whatever. Okay, so what then are the myths that are the basis of our own culture? Often we live in a culture, we live in our world, we can only see it on the surface. And often we don't understand what are the myths at the root and the basis of our own culture within Europe and America, Korea, wherever else it is, Africa, wherever else you're coming from, if you're listening here. What are the main myths? Well, I'm only going to be looking at the founding myths, really, underlying myths of Europe, but one can do the same kind of archaeology. So basically, this is an exercise in archaeology, try to uncover the foundation, the basis of our culture. So one of the foundations of Western culture are Greek myths and Greek philosophy. And another one is the Bible. And Christopher Davis, if he's here, will remind me other ones are also Celtic myth and Celtic custom. And I'm sure Bernard, I can see there, will do the same. And also the Norse gods as well, Viking stories as well, about which of course are embedded in the English days of the week. Monday is Moon Day, Tuesday is Dewey's Day. So each of the days of the week in English is connected to worshipping a particular god. Wednesday is Woden's Day, etc., etc. But anyway, I'm not going to look at the Norse or Celtic myths. I don't know much about them anyway. So I'm going to give you a little introduction here to Greek philosophy or Greek mythology. So the person who wrote this down was somebody called Hesiod. He wrote a little, it's called a cosmogony, which is a story about the origins of the gods and how they started off and lived on Mount Olympus in Greece. So I'm going to show, many of you may not be familiar with Greek myths, so I'm going to put on a little cartoon video which tells the story very quickly and quite entertainingly. And I hope it's going to work, because I don't know how good my upload speed is here, but I did put the link in the Facebook discussion page for joining the dots if any of you saw it there, where you could watch it.
So today we're going to understand that mess of the origin of the gods. Yes, soon enough you'll understand that mess is an extreme understatement. You know this theory of the origin from Hesiod's Theogony, which was a narrative of the Greeks' first mythical cosmogony. Let's begin. We're not sure how, but in the beginning there's an abyss of darkness. This is called chaos. After this first god follows Gaia, the Mother Earth, Tartarus of the depths of the earth, some say underworld, and Eros, the god of sexual desire. So to summarize, there's chaos, earth, underworld, and sexual desire. But remember, you can't see any of it because it is dark. Let's name the 12 gods called the Titans. Some say that Uranus hated the Hecatoncheires, so he hid his children on Crete. Others say that he hated the Titans, so he shoved them back up from where they were born. Either way, Gaia was not happy and asked the Titans to help her out. Sticking with the second story that Uranus shoved his children back into Gaia, when Uranus comes to have sex with Gaia, Kronos, who's been growing up inside her, chops off whatever he can get at from his angle. The blood hits the sea and creates more monsters, the Furies, giants, and nymphs. When his manliness hits the sea, it creates a foam which bears the child Aphrodite of love and desire. Now the Titans are freed and Kronos becomes the king. Now that that is solved, everything is peaceful, right? Let's see. Now we have Kronos as king and he marries his sister Rhea. They have children and then Kronos hears a prophecy that one of his children will take his throne. Being his father's son, this freaks him out, so he decides that he therefore must eat them. Rhea keeps having kids, but each time she pops them out, her husband gobbles them up. Understandably, this disturbs Rhea, so upon the birth of her sixth son, Zeus, she hands her husband a baby-sized stone to eat. He thinks nothing of it and pops the stone. Meanwhile, Zeus grows up on Crete where the nymphs help her raise him. And every time he cries, the guards bang their swords so Kronos won't hear him. When Zeus is older, he conspires with his grandma Gaia to get back at his dad, so they make Kronos throw up all of Zeus's brothers and sisters. When Kronos figures out what's happening, there's a battle, and Zeus does the only proper thing by chopping off his dad's genitals and tossing them into the sea. Karma much? Now Zeus is king because he frees the rest of his family. There's his siblings Hera, the goddess of marriage, Poseidon, god of the sea, Hades, god of the underworld, Hestia, goddess of the hearth, and Demeter, goddess of crops and harvest. These are the Olympians. Zeus keeps on taking control by banishing all the Titans of the last generation to the underworld. Zeus has one more great battle where his grandma Gaia had a kid with 100 heads covered by flame named Typhon. By now, Zeus has acquired the thunderbolt and he is able to drive him down and sentence him to providing for volcanoes. Now the story doesn't end. Just like any other king god, Zeus marries and hears his kid is going to overthrow him. We all know that Zeus reigned on and his genitals did not join his father's, so what do you do to make him different? Well, rather than stuffing the kids back up or swallowing them himself, he just swallows his wife before she has any kids. What about Odysseus' Athena? Wasn't she one of Zeus' sisters? No, when Zeus swallows his wife, it turns out she was already pregnant with a girl, so the child pops out of Zeus's head after he swallows her mother. Who else other than the cunning daddy's girl Athena? From then on, no one else really challenges Zeus, so other gods are born from incestuous relations with each other and so on. Now you will probably take away from this something like darkness, some gods, light, Titan gods, battle, new king that swallows Olympian gods, battle. Zeus has war between Titans and Olympians and then sends Titans to underworld. But that's just fine, because remember that all this is interpreted from a poem that does not give us all the details. Many people read the story differently. The opening lines give no more detail than, so if all you get is a concept of power, revenge, battle, sexism, familial love, and then familial love, that should be good enough because these themes of gods with very messy relationships and very human emotions resonates through all of Greek mythology.
Okay, I'm sorry, I muted myself there, and so I guess that muted the sound as well, did it, Simi? Yeah, sorry. Okay, all right, I won't do that again. Okay, so that's like in a very little summary. That's And so let's try and analyze it. So this is one of the founding myths of European culture and civilization. You go to art galleries, you can see paintings, you read literature, you can see these themes come up over and over again. So all the action then, it takes place on Mount Olympus. And all the major characters are all the gods. And by saying they're all gods, that means the human beings don't appear in these stories. Human beings are just like the playthings of the gods. The action's all about the gods, the relationship between the gods, and human beings, I said, they have no real place or no real significance in these stories, other than later on as playthings. You can also see here, there's a lot of sexual confusion. Lots of weird sexual stuff goes on. And the gods then, you can see the gods are not moral. They're not ideals in any sense at all. And it's all about power. Might is right. What is the right thing to do? It's, you know, the person who's the most powerful is the one who can get his way and impose his will upon others. And you can see there a lot of conflict, a lot of fighting going on. And if you look at the relationship there between husbands and wives, it's kind of very problematic and messy. And also the relationship between parents and children are also very, very problematic and messy as well. So these are basic themes then which permeate European culture. Another particular story I want to show you is this one here. It's called Oedipus Rex. It's by one of the great Greek playwrights called Sophocles. And again, anyway, hopefully you enjoy it, find it, and we'll analyze it, what it means in a moment.
Oedipus the King by Sophocles. Yeah, I'm the king, baby, but of thieves, not rock and roll. Well, still, it's a pretty cushy gig for the most part, except for that pesky curse that's making everyone wither and die. It's really a drag when there are no cows for the royal burger and your servant drops dead in your plate of wilted asparagus. I sent my brother-in-law, Creon, to the oracle to find out what the deal was. He got the answer right from Apollo's mouth. We needed to launch a full-scale investigation to find out who killed Thebes' previous king, Laius. I was on the case and was using proven crime-solving techniques, but my focus was pulled when that incredibly annoying chorus had to butt in. He helps solving the murders by asking for missiles. Yeah, all right. So I got the old coot to make an appearance, and you know what his helpful hint was? Apparently I'm the murderer. I think I'd remember something like that, don't you think? And then he told me I was going to die blind and alone, and went on some cockamamie tangent about me being married to my mother. Okay, all right, guys, look, where's the camera? Come on, I'm being punked, right? Ashton, where are you? Dude, where's my chariot? But I knew what was really going on. Creon and Tiresias were plotting to take over the kingdom. This wasn't the first time somebody had been after my crown. It was lucky for those backstabbers that my lady Jocasta showed up to calm me down. She told me all about how unreliable predictions can be. Like, once someone told Laius that Jocasta and Laius' son would kill him and marry her. Isn't that wild? But they got rid of that creepy kid. And I mean, yeah, I did kill a few guys in a fight a while ago. But anyway, that's ancient history, totally unrelated. Then a messenger showed up and dropped the bombshell that my dad was dead. But he really wasn't my dad, because apparently I was adopted. A lonely king and queen were shopping around for a kid and got one off a local shepherd or on eBay or something. I decided to investigate this shepherd, even though Joe didn't want me to. You'll be sorry. I probably should have listened to her, because then I wouldn't have learned that I was Laius and Jocasta's kid, which means... Yeah, sorry. Ugh. A servant came in at this dramatic moment and told me that Jocasta had killed herself. I couldn't believe my wife, my mom, was dead. Ugh. I was feeling a little emotionally fragile at this moment. You could say I was a sight for sore eyes. But I guess hindsight's always 20/20, right? At least I'm not being kept in the dark anymore. I'm sorry, these puns are getting cornea and cornea.
Okay, I don't know what the quality was like. Was it bearable, Simi?
So.
Okay, I downloaded one which didn't have take up too much memory, so the quality wasn't good. but I hope it was sort of followable. Anyway, the main implication of this here is that the Greek idea of fate. That means your fate is written into the stars and you cannot escape your fate. So no matter what King Laius and Jocasta did, they couldn't escape the fate whereby their son would kill his dad and marry his mother. And that's what happened. Oedipus killed his dad and married his mother. And no matter what people tried to do to avoid that, they couldn't avoid it. So this is the idea here, the future's closed and cannot be escaped. You cannot escape your fate. It's just written in the stars or it's written in your genes. And so this idea of fate then crept into or was drawn into Christian theology. When a lot of, when Christianity, it's not a Jewish idea, it's not a biblical idea of fate or predestination, but as a lot of pagans and non-Christians started to join the church, they brought these sort of Greek ideas into the church with them. And this became formalized as the Christian doctrine of predestination. So the Christian doctrine of predestination is predestined whether a person goes to heaven or hell. Even from the day you're born, it's already been predestined by God whether you go to heaven or you go to hell. There's nothing you can do to change your fate or to change that, because everything that happens is part of God's plan. And Augustine, one of the greatest of the Christian saints in the Western Christian church anyway, he talked about Felix culpa, oh happy fall of man. So they regarded the fall of man as part of God's plan. It was God's plan that Adam and Eve should fall so that Jesus would come into the world to show God's love of forgiveness and to bring salvation. So in that sense, everything that happens is part of God's plan. There's no free will, genuine free will in that sense. It's all predestined. So this idea of predestination, which you find in Christian doctrine, you also find seeped into philosophy. It's called determinism. And you have scientific determinism. So this is in many ways the basis of a lot of science the last many hundreds of years. This is Ilya Prigogine. He won a Nobel laureate for nonlinear thermodynamics. So he said the basic vision of classical physics, which is Newtonian physics, for example, was a conviction that the future is determined by the present. And therefore a careful study of the present permits an unveiling of the future. We may perhaps even call it the founding myth of classical science. So here's the idea which you find within classical physics, that if we understood and had all the information about where every single atom and particle was, then we'll be able to predict exactly what the future is going to be, because the future is contained in the present. That makes sense? The idea the future is contained in the present, which means that everything follows the laws of science. And there's only one possible outcome. So he disputed this in his nonlinear thermodynamics, but that's another story. But anyway, as he says here, he called it a founding myth of classical science. So this is basically an assumption about the nature of reality. You know, so when you say it's a myth, it's like it's an assumption, an unquestioned assumption about the nature of reality. And if you question many scientists about this, they can't let go of that. There's no scientific basis to it. It's just an assumption. Then this idea of determinism feeds also into historical determinism. Karl Marx talked about the inevitability of communism. In fact, when you read many history books, you get the sense that the person who's writing the history book is describing what happened, but also explaining why what happened. And you get the sense from many historians that what happened had to happen. Yeah, they're trying to explain what happened in terms of the economics and this and that and the other. And you get the impression that what happened had to happen. There was no alternative. And also you get social determinism. People talk about social deprivation. You know, if someone comes from a socially deprived background, they have to become, certain kind of problems that they have. Also economic determinism. This is a good book here. It's quite old now, written by Prigogine, called Order Out of Chaos. It's very interesting because it's the science in it's very understandable, but also it combines it with a lot of philosophical insight and philosophical reflections. And then going back to this Greek story then, this idea of fate means that another implication means I'm a victim and not responsible for my actions. You cannot hold me responsible for my actions if it's predestined that I should be what I am and that I should do what I do. So another of the great classics of Greek literature and of European culture is a book called the Iliad, written by Homer. He also wrote a book called the Odyssey, which will follow on. And in the Iliad, Agamemnon ascribes his behavior in wronging Achilles by taking his wife Briseis to Zeus. So Agamemnon, he's the king, and they're fighting a war. As a result of the battle, then Achilles, as part of his booty, he gets a wife, a beautiful woman who's the wife of the king who's just been slain. So he takes this woman, as his wife. And the Agamemnon, in a certain situation, he decides that he's more important than Achilles, so he decides to take Achilles' wife for himself. And Achilles obviously is very angry about this and upset, so he refuses to fight anymore. But then when Agamemnon is trying to explain or justify what he's done, he says this. He says, not I was the cause of the act, taking Achilles' wife, but Zeus and my fate, Moira, and the Furies, these are female kind of angry women, Furies, who walks in the darkness. They it was who in the assembly put wild folly in my understanding, on that day when I arbitrarily took Achilles' prize from him. So Agamemnon's saying here, it's not my fault. I was made to do it. And the way it works in the Iliad, when you read the Iliad, you can see the gods have their favorites amongst the human beings. And the gods are basically, the human beings then are like puppets. And the gods are pulling the strings. So when Agamemnon does that, he's saying, it's not me, don't blame me. It was Zeus who made me do it. Yeah, it's his fault, not my fault. This sense of I'm not responsible for my actions, don't blame me. It's fate, it's the gods. And this is this idea here, Zeus, it's the gods, and before that it's like fate. I can't avoid it. So again, that's a certain way of, so again, it's a basic assumption about the nature of reality. I'm not responsible for my actions. It's because of my genes, it's because of my background, it's because of my family, it's because of my country, it's because of this or the other. Don't blame me, don't hold me responsible for what I do. So this is important. You might wonder, well, why are we looking at Greek myths? It's because this is Cornford, it's quite an old book now. He wrote From Religion to Philosophy, a study of the origins of Western speculation. So he says, in Hesiod's cosmogony, it's Moira, fate or destiny, which partitions the world, imposing order. We'll look at that in a moment. Moira is later replaced by Zeus, who is in turn superseded by reason. But the function of the supreme power remains the same, to introduce distinction and order. So the point what he's making here is we start off with this myth about Moira or fate, and then we rationalize it a bit more, it's the gods, and you rationalize it a bit more, and it becomes a reason. So Greek philosophy then is just a transposition of Greek mythology with leaving out the gods. Yeah. So all the basic values, the basic assumptions that are transmitted and through the myths are then turned into philosophy based upon reason. Yeah. And so that's kind of really important to understand that. And so one thing is then, are Greek philosophy and biblical revelation different? And so often we talk about the difference between philosophy and revelation or science and religion, often giving the impression that they're different categories, they're different kinds of things, this reason-revelation kind of dichotomy. And so the interesting thing here is that Greek philosophy itself is based upon revelation. Yeah. So when I went to university, I studied philosophy, and this was sort of mentioned by the lecturers, but they said, you don't need to bother about that. They were just saying they got their ideas from the gods as just a way of trying to legitimize them. It wasn't real. You know, it's all about reason and rationality. Well, this is Parmenides. He's one of the greatest of the pre-Socratic philosophers. And he described where he got his philosophy and his ideas from. And he said he went on a sort of spiritual journey. And the goddess received me kindly in the spirit world somewhat. In her hand, she took my right hand, and she spoke and addressed me thus: O young man, accompanied by immortal charioteers and mares who bear you as you arrive at our abode, welcome. Come now, I shall tell and convey home. Come now, I shall tell, and convey home the tale once you have heard, just which ways of inquiry alone there are for understanding. The one, that is, that it is, and that it is not to be, is the path of conviction, for it attends upon true reality. So he's describing his philosophy and his ideas about the nature of reality and the essence of reality to information and messages, or revelation, if you like, that he received from a goddess. He doesn't say, I was sitting by the sea and thinking about it, and I came up with this idea. And Socrates also, he said, this is at his trial before he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He said, you've heard me give the reason for this in many places, what he does and what he says. I have a divine or spiritual sign. It's called a daemon. This began when I was a child. It is a voice. And whenever it speaks, turns me away from something I'm about to do. My familiar prophetic power, my spiritual manifestation. So Socrates himself, he attributed his ideas and his way of thinking to the gods, to some kind of revelation. And so when you look at this and you look at, well, what does it say in the Bible? So this is Isaiah, and he is a prophet in the Old Testament. He says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord. He was sitting on his throne, high and exalted, and his robe filled the whole temple. Around him flaming creatures were standing, each of which had 6 wings. Each creature covered its face with 2 wings and its body with 2, and used the other 2 for flying. I heard the Lord say, whom shall I send? Who will be our messenger? I answered, I will go, send me. So he told me to go and give the people this message. So when you look at that and you say, well, how is that really different to Socrates or Parmenides or any of the other many Greek philosophers who also attributed their ideas and their philosophy to the gods? There's not very much difference in that sense. And so that's why this is someone called Professor Cantwell Smith, one of the greatest thinkers about religion in the 20th century. He said Hellenism is basically a religion. He says it's legitimate and helpful to consider the Greek tradition in Western civilization, rationalist, idealist, humanist, within the generic context of various other religious traditions of mankind. It's neither absurd nor trite to reinterpret it as one of our planet's major religious traditions. Different, of course, from each of the others, yet comparable and understood most truly when so contrasted and compared. Okay, so he said, Greek philosophy, the Greek philosophical tradition and Hellenism is basically a religious tradition, and it is a basis for a culture, a Greek culture. Whereas so when you look at books of the history of philosophy, this is a fairly recent one, History of Philosophy by A.C. Grayling, look at the index. It starts off with philosophy before Plato. But hundreds of years before Plato, there were biblical philosophers. The Greek philosophers themselves, they said the Jewish people, they're a nation of philosophers. When people teach philosophy today, they don't teach the philosophy of the Bible. They don't teach the philosophy of Isaiah. They don't teach the philosophy of Jeremiah, which has its own epistemology, its own ontology, its own ethical system and everything else. So when people teach philosophy and study philosophy at university today, that's where they start, with the pre-Socratic philosophers. And then Plato, Aristotle, one of the greatest philosophers, and they work their way through till you end up later on with a continental philosopher and a postmodernist there. And then interestingly enough, this author, A.C. Grayling, he later on in his book, he talks about Indian, Chinese, African philosophy, being very woke, you might say, and he looks at Indian scriptures, but he completely ignores the biblical scriptures. He talks about medieval Christian philosophers like Aquinas and Duns Scotus and William of Ockham, but he completely ignores the philosophers in the Bible, such as Uzziah and what we call prophets. That's kind of interesting. Why, to try and understand why is it that in the West, philosophy doesn't include the Bible. Okay, so we're going to have a break now and look at that after the break.
Okay, I think everyone is back, or nearly everyone is back. Are you ready to resume, Uncle William?
Yeah, one problem. I forgot to press the record button for that first talk.
Don't worry. I know you did that, so I started recording.
Oh, did
I
you?
recorded about a minute late, so I missed about the first minute. But I've got
Well
most
done.
of it.
Well done.
Okay, so Jean-Sébastien very kindly and correctly reminded me that has also had a mythology. Escape. I need to unmute myself. Okay. Fascism and communism also are based on a mythology as well. But they were trying not to be based on a mythology. So, for example, the Nazi theory of race, it was supposed to be based upon the science of eugenics. And that was their justification for the Holocaust, for treating different races of people as having different value, and some have been subhuman. And that's what enabled them to go and gas and murder Jews and lots of other people, Roma. Communism also, it called itself scientific atheism. And so again, it's trying to pretend that it's based upon science, but actually it's just based upon an alternative myth in reality, claiming to be logical and scientific. So let's have a look then and try and understand why the Greek and biblical writings treated so differently. So this is from a Jewish author called Yoram Hazony. He's a philosopher, and he takes a very interesting perspective because he is standing outside the European tradition in one sense. And so he's able to look in from the outside, which a Christian or a secular person wouldn't be able to. So he said, we don't approach the Greek text by way of the same interpretive posture we do for the Jewish ones, because we look through the prism of early Christian doctrine, the reason-revelation dichotomy, which teaches us to see Greek wisdom as derived from reason, whereas what the Jews have to say is revelation. So this is, and the reason for that, the Christian reason-revelation dichotomy was intended to impart the conviction that the works of revelation were in some important sense superior to the works of reason, and therefore worthy of a special awe and respect. And so that's why the Bible is called Scripture. It's called the Word of God. You can't question it, you can't criticize it, you have to accept that because it's a revelation from God, therefore it stands on has a higher status than Greek philosophy, which is just created by human beings. And that was one way in which you could win an argument. Well, the Bible says this, and the Bible is the Word of God, but the Greek philosopher says that, well, that's just his idea, so we can just dismiss it. It's just one way of arguing. So fast forward about 1,500 years, and the Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century retained the dichotomy but reversed it. The old Judeo-Christian synthesis was declared to be a mistake and detrimental and unneeded. So during the Enlightenment, so up until then, the general view was that Bible is revelation, therefore has legitimacy, it has a huge amount of authority. But a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers, quite a few more atheists, said actually, if you can only give it authority by claiming it's the Word of God, then that doesn't work. And actually, reason is more authoritative, reason is more legitimate than the Bible and the Word of God. So you ended up, that dichotomy then was reversed and turned on its head. That's basically where we stand here. So if we look at some of these things, there's Kant, for example. He actually believed in God, came up with a good argument to prove the existence of God, but he wasn't a churchgoer and wasn't really interested in the Bible. And he said, we should ignore Hebrew scriptures because the Jews were an ignorant people with nothing to contribute to thought or culture. That was his view. Hegel, he said, only Greek and Teutonic German people do philosophy. And this is Wilhelm von Humboldt, a very intelligent person, a very influential person within European thought in the 19th century. And he said, knowledge of the Greeks is not simply pleasing, useful and necessary to us. It is only in them that we find the ideal which we ourselves would like to be and to bring forth. We acquire from contemplation the Greek something more earthly, something even almost divine. So it's really reversed the dichotomy here to say actually the knowledge and the ideals that we have and we aspire to fulfill, they come from the Greeks and not from the Bible. Yeah, and that then, he was the founder of Berlin University, and that became the model for all German and American research universities, this model of of reason being the foundation of knowledge, and particularly an exalted position of Greek philosophy. So Yasuni Haran commentary on this is the elevation of the Greeks as the sole source of learning and knowledge announced a profound reconfiguration of Christian Europe's self-understanding. So all the ancient universities, Oxford, Cambridge, and other ones like this, Paris, they were all monastic foundations. They weren't secular foundations. They weren't founded by the state, unlike Berlin. They were religious foundations and a very different basis. So when you start to ignore the religious foundation of European culture and civilization, you just focus upon one strand, which is the Greek strand, then you end up with a very secular kind of education, a very secular way of thinking, a very secular kind of culture. And that's basically what's happened in the last few years. And so that's why, as I said, very few history of philosophy books refer to the Hebrew scriptures. Yeah. Because of this. That's why you start off with the pre-Socratics with no recognition of the contribution to philosophical thought of the biblical tradition. It's just not there. You know? So, a book well worth reading if you want to read about this sort of area, the philosophy of Hebrew scripture, where he draws out the prophets and treats all the prophets as being philosophers in the same way you would treat the Greek philosophers as philosophers. He doesn't he doesn't discriminate or distinguish between them in terms of their significance in the realm of thought. Anyway, so Kant said, well, he haven't done contributed anything towards world cultural civilization. So let's have a look at that then. This here is Egyptian hieroglyphics, and as you probably know, they used to have little animals and little symbols is the way they used to write, and it took people a long time to decipher them. This French chap called Champollion, he was able to decipher them using the Rosetta Stone. Anyway, so this ox then, all it represents is the first sound of the word ox, ah. Okay, so that if you wanted to put the sound ah, you put an ox. If you wanted a sound for something else, you'd draw another little thing whose first syllable was that sound. So the ancient letter Aleph started a picture of an ox, but obviously it's a lot of hard work drawing an ox like that every time you want to produce an ah. So they simplified it, and the Proto-Canaanites, so this is the land which is now state where Israel, Palestine is. This area here, the Canaanites, they simplified this and they just drew the head of an ox, the head and the horns. Anyway, they decided to simplify it a bit more, and early Phoenician and Hebrew, they just turned it slightly like that. So here you can see the horns of the ox and the head of the ox, and just a quicker way of drawing it. And this moved around here to that time here, early Aramaic, the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it evolved to be like this, the time of Jesus, modern Hebrew. And yeah. Anyway, so this was early Hebrew and the Phoenicians, and then through travel and through trade, this idea of using symbols like this meant you could write things down very easily. And so the Greeks picked this up. So here this was turned on its side and became early Greek, Aleph, and the Greek small one is like this. Lost it. Where am I? Is that sort of symbol, and like a fish on its side. And early Greek became Etruscan, Latin, and modern English. And so the word alphabet, alpha is the Greek word first letter, but Aleph is the Hebrew first letter. So actually the Greek alphabet, in fact, all these cursive strips, they all come from this early Hebrew. And this is the Proto-Sinaitic script around about the time of Abraham. And so when it talks about Moses writing down the word of God, they actually had a script which they could write down and people could read. And so the Hebrew letter Dalet, it means a door. So it's the early Hebrew, it's the middle Hebrew. And when they wanted to count numbers, they thought, okay, how can we represent a number? So late Hebrew, they turned the late Hebrew into a letter number 4. That's the modern Hebrew. And this Middle Hebrew here became the Greek delta, yeah, and the Roman D. So we can look here, we can see these things as, yeah, the letter B. Okay, well that's what it is. What a small letter B is that on its side? Well, that's a house. It's like a tent. Yeah, so bet. The third letter in Hebrew is Gimel, which means camel, and that's like a camel's hump. You turn it on its side and you get a C, as in gift. The fourth letter is Dalet, which is door. So it's like the door to a tent, and that becomes a D, as in door. And etc., etc. You can work your way. This one here is Chet, which means a fence, and this is like a fence on its side. You simplify it and you end up with an H. So that's, you know, where a lot of these letters, they come from here. So you can see his extraordinary contribution then of Hebrew and the Jewish people towards European culture and civilization. Okay, so let's have a look at some elements of Greek philosophy. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. One of the most important questions they ask, what is the nature of reality? What is the essence of things? And that's, of course, you know, why do people ask that question? Because people want to understand the world in which we're living. We have all these questions, why, what, where, when, because we want to understand what is the nature of reality. And the Greek philosophers, what is the nature of reality? Is it made of one substance or many substances? And if it's many substances, how are these substances related to each other? So I'm not going to go through it all in any detail. So one of the earliest philosophers says, Thales, he said it's water, everything's made of water. Pythagoras said actually everything's made of number. We'll look at him later. Heraclitus said everything's in flux, everything's changing, you can't step into the same river twice. Parmenides said everything is unchanging, nothing's changing at all. And they had these different kind of ideas. This one here said everything's made of a plurality of fire, earth, water. Zeno came up with all kinds of funny paradoxes about tortoises and hares chasing each other. And as a result of that, Democritus came up with his idea of the atom. So lots of different ways trying to understand the nature of reality. Socrates who came along and changed the direction of Greek philosophy to consider ethics and the good life. So why did he do that? It's all to do with trying to make sense of reality. We categorize things. So this is, you know, from the Bible. The Lord God formed from the earth every beast of the field and every fowl of the heavens, and he brought it to man to see what he would call it. And whatever the man called each living thing, that was its name. So this is the way in which we try to make sense of the world in which we live. We try to give it a name. We try to categorize things. Yeah. So children are always saying, what is that? What is that? What is that? What is that? They want to know what the name of something is. What's the difference between this and this? And part of learning is to learn the difference between a cat and a dog, and the difference between this and the difference between that. And as Ludwig Wittgenstein said, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. So that's why if you have a very large vocabulary, you can describe things in a very sophisticated, very nuanced way. If you have a very small vocabulary, it's much more difficult. And so sometimes you play this game, animal, vegetable, mineral. And through, you know, getting down to one category, to narrowing the categories down until you can actually identify a particular thing. It's a very, you know, common game. So that's the way in which you make sense of reality, is to try to categorize things and come up with names for things. So the Greeks then, that's what they were doing as well. And Pythagoras then, he was also trying to categorize reality as he saw it and as it appeared to him. And so he came up with this table of opposites, and it's recorded by Aristotle. We don't actually have the actual writings of the early pre-Socratics, very rarely survived. So he said everything is either this or it's that. Either, I'll explain the meaning of these in a moment. Either something is chaotic or there's order. Numbers, which he's interested in, either numbers are odd or they're even. He said either you have one thing or you have many things. Either you turn right or you turn left. Either something's male or female. Either something's resting or moving. Either it's straight or curved. Either something's light or dark, good or bad, or square or oblong. And, you know, he emphasized very much about mathematics because he thought that through mathematics you could describe the true essential nature of things. And these truths then were eternal like maths. He also came up with lots of ideas about music. So you might wonder, well, okay, what's the significance of this table of opposites? We'll look at it in a bit more detail in a moment. So someone called Bertrand Russell, he wrote one of the standard textbooks of the history of Western philosophy. He said, I do not know, this is his conclusion, anyway, the concluding chapter of his book, he said, I do not know of any other man who has been as influential as Pythagoras was in the sphere of thought. The whole conception of the eternal world is derived from him. So Pythagoras then, his ideas had a bigger impact upon European culture and European civilization and philosophy and development of the thoughts and the mind than anybody else. So let's go back and have a look at this table of opposites a little bit more then. So we look at them, you wonder, well, okay, is this an accurate description or not? So an interesting thing, first of all, they're called a table of opposites. There's no sense that these are complementary or attract each other. They're like opposites. And when we look down this list, we can see one interesting thing is, oh, there's good and there's bad in this list. Okay, so the first thing is, this for Pythagoras, who's basically reflecting the way the Greeks thought and the Greek conception of reality, because he wasn't the only person who came up with a similar list. Yeah, he was just, trying to write down in a list what most people seem to think at that time. So when you have good and you have bad in this list, that means, first of all, that from this perspective, good and bad are woven into the fabric of the universe. You can't have good without bad. And that's a common expression in English. You can't have good without evil. It's just an assumption about the nature of reality that people have. If you question people, they say, well, that's just the way it is. You can't have good without evil. It's an unexamined assumption or presupposition of the whole of our culture in many ways. So for the Greeks then, good and evil is woven into the fabric of the universe. You can't have good without evil. It's a form of dualism. Of course, this has all kinds of implications. One is that, well, if you can't have good without evil, what's the point in trying to change the world? There's no point. If you can't get rid of evil, you might as well accept that it's always going to be evil. And so instead of trying to get involved in trying to change the world and get your hands dirty, you may as well just withdraw from the world. And lots of Greeks took that as an idea. They just withdrew from the world, didn't want to get involved in politics or anything, this idea. So it becomes a very, very conservative kind of way of thinking. The other interesting thing is, as Aristotle himself noticed, he said Aristotle associated moral prestige with the left-hand column, the A column, because the good things appear in that column. So because good is here, goodness is here, then everything in this column then is associated with goodness. Everything in this column here is associated with evil or with bad. And so let's have a look at that and try and figure that out. Is that really true? Okay, let's have a look at a few of these pairings. There's right and there's left. Okay, if we think of left, okay, what's the Latin word for left is sinister. What does the word sinister mean in English? It means evil. So that's why traditionally in European culture, left-handed people have been treated rather suspiciously. And often left-handed people were forced to write with their right hand. You have to do the right thing, the good thing. Yeah, the word, I know there are quite a few people here from Russia, pravda. It means right, and also means truth. Yeah, so we have that embedded in our language. Yeah, that right is good, left is bad. Okay, lots of other things as well. The pursuit of the one is better than the many. It's better to be united than for there to be diversity. And so we can see this is one of the pursuits of the whole of European history as being an attempt to create one culture, one state, one law, one emperor, one currency, etc., etc. Romans did it, and Charlemagne tried to do it. Napoleon tried to do it, Hitler tried to do it, the communists tried to do it, European Union is trying to do it. It's all this sense that everything on this side is good and this side is bad. And then, order is good, chaos is bad, like the free market. Odd and even, I can't remember what the explanation for that is now. And then, of course, here you find male and female. And that's why good then is associated with male, and female is associated with bad, with evil. It's interesting. Resting and moving. Resting is good. So a lot of people's vision of heaven is everybody is just sitting around resting, not doing anything. Whereas, like that. I'm not going to talk about this now. So this is Derrida. He's a French postmodernist. He said, analyzing this, what are the implications? Western thought, says Derrida, has always been structured in terms of dichotomies or polarities: good versus evil, being versus nothingness, presence versus absence, truth versus error, identity versus difference, mind versus matter, man versus woman, soul versus body, life versus death, nature versus culture, speech versus writing. And one of the other categories here, in the Greek, they thought the man has a mind and a woman has a body. So what impact did that have, do you think, upon women's education in European history? Pretty bad impact. And so, again, another philosopher analyzing this says the whole reductionist enterprise in Western philosophy may be seen as a conquest of B by a transcendent A. So when we look at the whole of Western philosophy, it's a conquest of B by a transcendent A, so trying to impose order upon chaos. So that's where we looked at, Cornford saying that fate led to Zeus, led to reason, but always trying to impose order upon chaos, trying to impose, get rid of the many, trying to impose one, trying to get rid of all the left-handed people. And, along with this, a lot of oppression of women and feminine values and femininity within European culture. Trying to stop things from moving, you just have to sit still, don't move, that we need to have straight cucumbers, etc., etc., etc. This kind of thing going on. And that's, one trying to dominate the other because they're irreconcilable. And so as Wittgenstein said, he said an entire mythology is stored within our language. So that's the whole point. Behind our language, the English, and I'm sure most other European language, you find this mythology is embedded there and we're not even aware of it. In many different ways. So for example, if I were to say to you, I can see Peter here in my screen, Peter Schroeder. If I say to you, Peter, stop being so negative, would you be happy? No.
No.
Because the word negative, and if I said, you're looking really positive today, and you'd be happy. So when we think about the words positive and negative, we think about it in terms of electricity. We don't say protons are good and electrons are evil. We don't talk about positive electricity and negative electricity is good and evil electricity. It's not only the negative wire that will kill you, but the positive wire will just warm you up. Positive and negative, in terms of science, is just completely neutral. But but within the language, we have a moral overlay as well. So positive and negative, also there's a moral overlay. Positive is good, negative is evil. That makes sense? It's the same with left and right hand. Well, it's just left or right. What's the difference? But on top of that language, there's a moral overlay. And so we find that so much of our language, there's this moral overlay, which is a reflection of this Pythagorean way of thinking. So it's permeated our whole language and permeates our grammar. So as Wittgenstein said, a whole mythology is stored within our language. And so the way in which we use our language, we're unaware of the world in which we're thinking, the world in which we're living, which is seriously influenced by this kind of philosophical background. We think about the principle is very different. You talk about the principle, dual characteristics, positive and negative, but good and evil aren't in those categories. There's no moral overlay that positive is good and negative is evil. Even though within our spiritual community, we still use the terms, the words in that way, which is not right, I don't think. So this is very important then. This is someone called Friedrich Hayek. He's a very significant thinker. He won a Nobel laureate for economics, and he's from Austria. He died quite a long time ago now, I guess. Anyway, he he met Father several times. He used to come to science conferences in the 1980s, and Father gave him the Founders Award. I think Father only gave it to 2 or 3 people. It's like Father's version of the Nobel Prize in recognition of his thought and his contribution. Anyway, so one of the things he said it's not merely that the knowledge of earlier generations are communicated to us through the medium of language. The structure of the language itself implies certain views about the nature of the world. By learning a particular language, we acquire a certain picture of the world, a framework for thinking within which we henceforth move without being aware of it. And so if you're running a certain kind of language around your head, a particular software running around your head, you're not aware of it. It's only for people who are able to speak more than one language fluently, they realize if you think in one language, you see the world differently and you behave differently, your sense of self is different than when you're thinking in a different language. So, which is why, sometimes we can't find the words to express ourselves in one language, but we can easily find the words to express ourselves in another language, because every language then is like a social construct. It's, it contains all kinds of stuff about the way of the world. And so the structure of the language itself implies certain views about the nature of the world. I said every language is a social construct. So if you're speaking English, then we just say you, and everybody's you. Whereas if you're speaking French, it's either tu or vous. The tu is the singular, but also the intimate, personal kind of way of talking to someone. Vous is more impersonal as well as being plural. In English, we used to have tu. It's called thou, but it dropped out of the language because the English became more and more reserved and less capable of forming intimate relationships with people. So that particular pronoun just dropped out of use. You only find it in poetry now or in the Bible. People who are from Oriental countries, then they're very interested when they first meet somebody to find out how old they are, because either they're talking to somebody in terms of up to them because they're elder, or to they're younger, because the language itself is structured in certain ways. You speak to someone who's older, certain ways you speak to somebody who's younger. Of course, this prioritizes the opinions of someone who's older. So when I was studying at Cambridge, my tutor told me that when Japanese students studied, he said they always spoke to, although when they socialized, they only spoke in Japanese. When they wanted to talk about academic things, about their studies, they only spoke in English. And I wondered why. And he said, well, when they're speaking in Japanese, then the one who's oldest, his views and opinions hold more prestige, and it's much harder for a younger person to criticize him. But if they want to study about truth and intellect and about ideas, then they want to talk about ideas. And it doesn't matter whether somebody's older or younger, their ideas shouldn't be given priority based upon their age. And so that's why they would speak in English, which is a much flatter language. So you can see here, if you only speak one language, you're unaware of these kind of subtleties. When you speak several languages, you're aware actually the world is different, and our language structures ourselves. We're structured according to the language we speak, and our relationships with other people are also structured by the language in which we're speaking and which we move. Anyway, Hayek spoke several languages, so he was aware of that. For me, I can only read about it because I don't know much. I can't speak any other language fluently. But I think, it's something to think about, the effect that our language has upon who we are and how we relate. And also, as I said, Wittgenstein said the mythology that is embedded in that language. It's really important to try and tease these things out. That's a book that Hayek wrote. I said he's an economist, but also he wrote a very foundational book of theoretical psychology about cybernetics and things like that. Okay, what's next? So so you can see this in examples from poetry. This is just English poetry, of course. Shakespeare said, in his play comedy, "All's Well That Ends Well." Good without evil is like light without darkness, which in turn is like righteousness without hope. Again, it was like a basic assumption in the nature of reality. You can't have good without evil. That's just the way the world is. Edmund Spenser, who wrote The Faerie Queene, said the earth, the air, the water, and the fire. These are the 4 different ways in which elements or substances the Greeks thought everything was made of. The earth, the air, the water, and the fire then began to range themselves in huge array like an army, and with the contrary forces conspire, each against other by all means they may. So again, the Greek understanding of the nature of reality was one of conflict and contradiction. And again, that's expressed, passed on through the poetry and through the literature. John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, said, hot, cold, wet and dry, 4 champions fierce strive here for mastery. So again, this idea that the natural world is one of conflict, or one of opposites. So if we look at this idea of order and chaos a bit more, because it's really significant, some of Jordan Peterson, who has studied a lot of Taoism and has drawn a lot upon this ideas of order and chaos, which I found quite interesting. He said, being for Taoists is composed of 2 opposing principles, often translated as feminine and masculine. However, yin and yang are more accurately described as chaos and order. So when we talk about the principle, we use the yin and yang symbol, and we talk about masculine and feminine. And so I was wondering for a while, how should one locate chaos and order, which is a very fundamental, thing, really, categories. And so he says chaos and order are like feminine and masculine. So he said chaos and order are fundamental elements because every lived situation is made up of both. We inhabit an order surrounded by chaos. We occupy known territory surrounded by the unknown. To straddle that duality is to be balanced. Well, we're all experiencing that today. We thought we were living in a very orderly society, and then we made all kinds of plans for where we're going to go on holiday and business and everything. And then suddenly chaos emerged. A virus came along and spread all over the world, and everybody's plans were thrown into disorder, and into chaos. So these 2 fundamental elements, we have order, but at the same time, not everything is orderly. There's always a bit of randomness, a bit of chaos around. And we need to get a balance between the 2. If you just become incredibly orderly, then you lose flexibility. If everything is just incredibly chaotic, then you can never get anything done. So you need to have order and chaos in balance with each other. Just like that book I was telling you about, Prigogine. Need to have order, plans, but also the flexibility to adjust and to adapt. And that's what it is to be a balanced person, able to adapt. So order, the known, is symbolically associated with masculinity. And Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist. This is his field of study and expertise. Order, the known, is symbolically associated with masculinity because the primary hierarchical structure of society is masculine, the patriarchy. Men are the builders of cities, the engineers, the stonemasons. Order pushed too far is very destructive. You end up with authoritarianism and ultimately with a concentration camp where you try to fit everybody into the system, and anybody who won't fit into this system, you just get rid of them and you kill them. Chaos, the unknown, is symbolically associated with femininity. All things we encounter were born of the unknown. Chaos is matter. That's the Latin word for mother. Chaos is matter, origin, mother, the substance from which all things are made. So we talk about matter, it's mother, it's everything's made from it. It's what matters, what's important. Chaos is possibility, the source of ideas, gestation and birth, darkness of the cave. And so that's where, new life emerges from a mother's womb, coming out of the darkness of a cave, and the unknown, all these different aspects. You have the grizzly bear. If someone comes along to threaten the cubs, then out of compassion and love, it goes and completely wipes out the predator or the threat. And of course, there's sexual selection. So, women decide whether or not they want to marry somebody and want to have sex with a man. And, they decide either he's good enough genetically or by status or anything else or not. And so that's that aspect as well, the unknown. So I thought that was interesting, this balance and chaos and order. So here you can see the important here is about the balance. But within the Greek philosophical tradition, it was about one trying to eliminate the other, as opposed to trying to find the balance. You have tables of opposites, one trying to wipe out the other. Whereas the Taoist view is actually they're complementary, and you need both, and you need to have a balance between the two and harmony between the two. That's why the Taoist view is, the importance of, relationship between husband and wife, king and queen. It's really important to get that balance, for the nation to be balanced and to work well, for the family to be balanced and to work well. And that was from this book, Jordan Peterson, 12 Rules for Life. Well worth reading, An Antidote to Chaos. All right, let's see. Do I want to stop here? Okay, I just want to briefly finish this. Okay, so I personally think this is really important. I've been thinking about it for a long time. So I've come across some other people who started to think this is important, feminist philosophers in particular. It's a book on ethics and feminism, published 5 years ago. Can we learn something from the Pythagorean table about the way in which female inferiority was represented in Greek thought? And that's really important. Femininity and female positions being really inferior and badly represented in Greek thought. Often people think, oh, it's the Bible. It's not the Bible, it's Greek thought and the Greek philosophical tradition. Everyone knows, this is a feminist philosopher writing here, everyone knows that women are inscrutable, inconstant, closer to nature, that the female sex has a special relationship with the irrational. But to construct the ideological tradition, which has spawned this knowledge, inverted commas, must in the end be a gesture, not an affirmation, but a critique. So finally getting around to critique and analysis of the basic assumptions that underlie European and Western philosophy and the whole of Western culture. And this has a huge influence anyway. Masculinity expresses itself in coherence, a value which brings together unity and determinacy. Femininity, by contrast, expresses itself in incoherence, that is, in plurality, indeterminacy, changing of mind, which are understood not as positive characteristics, but as a negation or absence of their opposites. So she says we're dealing here with texts which claim to describe, and in a secondary, consequential, and partial way do describe how things are with respect to gender identity. But at the same time, the very existence of these texts is a component of the political formation which feminism is calling into question. So feminists now, they're starting to deconstruct the philosophical basis of European culture and recognizing this table of opposites, or nowadays people talk about binaries, yeah? People say I'm non-binary because people don't want to associate with binaries, because the binaries are either in the A column or in the B column, and it's not a comfortable place to be, because one is associated with good and one is associated with bad. So the binaries that people are rejecting and reacting against, these binaries that are the basis of our culture, people don't realize what it is they're reacting against. There's a sense that there's something wrong. So we need to uncover, this is sort of archaeology, uncover the roots of where this fallen society, this fallen world comes from. Because as she says, it's a description of the way things are. Yeah, it's a description of the way the fallen world is. So what Pythagoras is describing is the way the fallen world was. It was into philosophical expression, the basic values of the culture in which he was living. Yeah, so that's why there's such a powerful table, such powerful ideas, because all he was doing was articulating, expressing, and formalizing the basic assumptions of fallen society, which have then been perpetuated from generation to generation. And it's very hard to get out of this. So this is another one. Feminist philosopher Sabina Lovibond, who we were just reading, has explored the association of the unlimited or infinite and femaleness beginning in ancient Greek philosophy. From her, we learn that Pythagorean Platonic philosophers, the infinite was a term of abuse. It was associated with chaos, matter, and femaleness, while the finite was good, associated with order, form, and maleness. An early 20th century feminism of difference informed by Irigaray proposes a return to the ancient conception of the infinite as female while reversing its value from bad to good. It's strange, So you can see here, she's, okay, let's take the good and the bad, let's just swap it around. Let's say the male is bad and the female is good. But they're still locked within this way of understanding the nature of reality. One is good, one side is good, one side is bad. So this feminist philosopher, certainly last year, 3 years ago now, is saying, let's just swap them around. Yeah. So again, there's a lot of that kind of discourse going on in the world today, a lot of that kind of language. And she defends her view that maleness is infinite. Yet her defense seems to be reliant upon inconsistent readings of gender. Yeah, in relation to two central conceptions. Okay, so there's a little critique here. Actually, she's stuck within the same kind of dichotomy. She can't escape from this dichotomy because the whole of European culture has been formed by this kind of way of understanding the nature of reality. The principle, as we're looking at in a few days or maybe next week, tries to conceptualize reality in a very different kind of way. Okay, so we're going to talk about Marxism, not enough time for that. We'll leave that until tomorrow. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. And Joanna came up with a good idea yesterday. She said that if I look over my participants list, then if people raise their hand, then they can ask me a question verbally. So I don't know if anybody would like to ask a question. If you just somehow, if you go down to, if you open your participant list thing and you go to, you can somehow raise your hand. Can't remember how now. Anybody remember?
So you have a set of reactions.
Oh, yeah.
And there you can raise your hand. But also I've been recording all the questions that have been coming up. So I actually have a few.
Oh, good. Okay, I haven't followed them because I can't see the chat as I'm teaching, so it's, yeah.
Yeah, so I've got you.
Oh, good. Okay, thanks. Have you got one there, Simi, then I can answer?
Yeah, so the first one I've got is, can we associate the significance of language with medieval nominalism?
Jean-Sebastian, only you would ask that. I personally am a nominalist. Well, I'm going to look at nominalism and realism in a few days' time. When I start, well, no, actually, probably maybe tomorrow or the day after when I start looking at Platonic philosophy. I think that's a better place to address that question. Is that okay, Jean? Good, you're nodding your head, thank you. I got another one there, Simi?
Yeah, this one's a bit more from the start. It says, how did we get to stories such as the creation of the universe or Adam and Eve? I don't presume they wrote it down before written text was discovered.
Okay, that's a different lecture. That's on Abraham. And I spent a long time explaining about Abraham, who was the father of faith, and explaining how I understood that he discovered these stories, monotheism, there's only one God, God is good. And I think that's where these stories come from. I think they come from Abraham. There are precursors to these stories, which you can find in Sumerian literature. So, for example, something called the Gilgamesh epic, and it's like a version of Noah's flood, the flood with Noah. It's older than the story you find in the Bible. It's a story that Abraham himself would have known. But then I think what happened is that Abraham took this story and he retold it, so it transmitted and embodied different values and different ideas and different lessons. So the idea of the Garden of Eden also, that comes from Sumeria as well. So I think Abraham, through his encounter and experience with God, he took these existing stories and he recast them and he retold them. And that's where we get the story of the creation of the world in 6 days, and the story of the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve and the fall, and Noah. But that's a different series of lectures about when I teach the divine principle. Herbert, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. When Pythagoras make these kind of opposites like good and bad, which caused a lot of problems. I think in Buddhism, and I'm not sure of in Hinduism or in Advaita tradition, they have the same problem. Because they say good has to exist and bad has to exist. They're both part of the same thing. And my question is, after this, then also is it parallel or how they came to that conclusion?
Well, when you look at the world in which you live, there's lots of bad stuff going on, lots of good stuff, so people assumed you can't have one without the other. And that's a basic assumption in lots of religions and lots of philosophies. Abraham's conclusion was there is one God, and God is good. And that's why after each day of the 6 days of creation, God said, it is good, it is good, it is good, and it is very good. and then evil then comes into the world as a mistake. Evil is not necessary. Evil is a mistake. And because I'll look at this next, I think tomorrow or the day after, I'll unpack that story. But yeah. Anybody found another question there, Simi?
I found quite a good one.
Oh yeah, good.
How to clearly distinguish between dualism and dual characteristics as explained in the principle.
I'll come on to that.
Great, looking forward to it.
Now, when we look at understanding the nature of reality from a principle point of view, then I'll be talking that and the implications, all that stuff, and then going back to compare it with what we've been looking at now, the Greek philosophical tradition.
Okay, and then what's the unificationist myth and how can we change it?
What is unificationist what?
Myth.
Myth. How can you change it? It's also a story. It's based upon the biblical story and, you know, this whole history. How to change it? I mean, again, that's a different series of lectures. That's my reading life through the principle lectures, where I think a lot of these stories have been misunderstood and mistold, and so I think it's been quite damaging for our spiritual community. So I go back into these stories, flesh them out, look at them in much more depth and detail, and try to see how they should be understood and explain. But again, that's another whole 7 days, to be honest. Well, it's 21 days actually. I spend 7 days, 5 hours a day in a 7-day workshop just teaching the Genesis stories. So it's a long thing to go through all that.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Liz. Anybody else? One more question I think we have time for.
Tig has his hand up.
Okay. Tig, what do you want to ask or say? Where are you?
Oh, hi, Uncle William. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, Tig.
Hi. Well, sorry, I wish I saw the whole lecture. I came like an hour late. So I was wanting to ask you, do you think you were talking about earlier with good and evil, do you think we need to, do you think that we need to kind of understand good to know what evil is? Or like, do you think that's not true? Do you think we need to know what evil is and have evil to understand what good is?
I don't think so. I think you can know good without evil. I mean, if you go along and you go to a party, you have a really good time, having a really good time, an enjoyable time, that's great. You feel really good. You don't need to be mugged and beaten up and robbed on the way home to appreciate how great the party was.
I agree with that.
So, anyway, just Simi, do you want to close? I'd just like to thank you. I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of it, and hope to see you tomorrow. God bless you. Have a good night or a good day, depending where you are on the time zone. Bye, Amma. Nice to see your face.
Thank you, Uncle William. Yes. Everyone who's given me that email, I have it. I will send you the recordings from yesterday and today. Thank you once again, Uncle William. And I guess I will just close now in a prayer. So please join me in prayer. Good evening once again, Heavenly Parent and True Parents. We just finished our second session of this Joining the Dots workshop. It's very insightful and some really interesting questions are being raised. So I pray that we can keep our brains churning until tomorrow and really dig deep into this unique content that we have. And I want to thank you and offer this time now to you in my name on behalf of all my brothers and sisters here. Simra Marai, daughter of a blessed and true family, Jew. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
See you same time tomorrow.
See you.
Bye.